growing economic uncertainty and concerns about protectionism, the Belt and Road Initiative is again drawing worldwide attention at the second forum here in Beijing this week. What are deliverables of the initiative? How will multilateralism defend global development? And how will Brexit reshape the world economy? To discuss these issues and more, I'm very happy to be joined by Andrew Mitchell, member of the British Parliament and former Secretary of State for International Development, and Victor Gao Zhikai, Vice President at Center for China and Globalization. That's our topic. This is a dialogue. I'm Yang Rui. Welcome to our discussion here, gentlemen. Let's take a look at the broad context within which we look at the issue of BRI. Here are two trends that go against each other. One is globalization, the other deglobalization, with the protectionism, unilateralism, and populism somehow standing for deglobalization. Do you think BRI was put forward right in time to serve as a counter-argument against the process of deglobalization? Andrew?
Well, it's a very interesting question, and of course BRA comes at a point when we are under some pressure from protectionism around the world, and indeed it's one of the happy circumstances I find at the moment that we have more in common with the Chinese government's approach on protectionism and on climate change than we do with the Trump White House. And as someone who's been steeped in international development politically for many years now, I worry a great deal about the protectionist influences, the forces against multilateralism which are loose at the moment. And I hope very much that the BRI initiative, which I don't pretend to understand in huge detail, has great impetus behind it towards freeing the trading system more and building prosperity through economic activity and turning its back on protectionist tendencies.
Well, BRI initiative is truly unprecedented in scale as well as in the nature of this initiative, and its focus on connectivity and infrastructure is really what many countries in the world would need. And it actually preceded this latest round of protectionism or populism, and generally speaking, protectionism of all forms probably existed for many, many years, and it comes up and down, for example, and even without BRI, for example, this wave of protectionism would have happened anyway. However, I think the timing really is intriguing, mainly because while BRI preceded the latest round of protectionism, it is more timely now for us to talk about connectivity and globalization, and this is really in the context of what some major countries are really talking about the wrong thing and try to walk the wrong walk. And I think this really put the BRI initiative even more in the context. And I think in China at least we are firmly confident that BRI is the right talk and China wants to walk the right walk, and many countries in the world now realize that there are two roads in front of us, and China stands for more connectivity, more infrastructure building, and a greater development, more inclusive development for all the participating countries involved.
Speaker of the House of Commons in Britain has made it very clear they would not welcome President Donald Trump when he goes to visit the UK in early June. Having said that, Brexit does represent the momentum of unilateralism and the rise of populism. When you say you take side with the Europeans and Chinese on the issue of multilateralism, how would you examine the impact of a Brexit, and particularly its impact upon the trend, the mega trend of globalization? Andrew.
Well, the principal worry that the Germans, I think, have about Brexit is that on issues to do with protectionism, Britain and Germany have always been very staunch allies. And whether there's been a Labour European Commissioner or a Conservative European Commissioner from Britain, they have, over the last many years, stood up for freeing up the trading system and moving away from the protectionist tendencies, which are very much alive in the European Union. So I think that one of the first effects of Brexit on effects of Britain leaving on the European Union will be that there will be a less strong argument inside the Commission, a less strong argument within the European Union to turn away from protectionism, to turn away from any concept of fortress Europe, and to open up the system. And so that is clearly a negative. And as you say, there has been an outbreak of populism. We see it, Brexit is an example of it, Donald Trump is an example of it. And these are bad times for the international rules-based system. As China emerges as the world's superpower, as your economy, before very much longer, will be the largest economy in the world, does China seek to refashion the old multilateral system, or does it seek to build something slightly different? And Britain hopes that China, which has already been taking on this much bigger role in the world, we hope very much that we will be able to work with China to ensure that the multilateral system is fit for purpose in the coming years. It very much is drawn from the post-Second World War settlement. The 5 members, permanent members of the Security Council, are all from the victors of the Second World War, and there's no doubt that the rules-based system is going to have to be updated and modernized, and clearly China will play an enormous role in deciding what that modernization is.
Victor, is it true that China finds it increasingly difficult to cope with the bipartisan politics in many of the countries, not only BRI or emerging markets, but taking United Kingdom of Britain as an example, the golden days of the bilateral relationship during the David Cameron years is so different from what Theresa May pursues. And therefore, we can no longer pin our hopes on, say, rhetoric of a political leadership like what Prime Minister David Cameron says. Having said this, do you think Martin Wolf, chief economist of Financial Times, says wisely that Britain is going back to the image of a sick man of Europe? It has 6 crises, ranging from political crisis, economic crisis, to leadership crisis, and the crisis of national identity. He pinpointed 6 problems concerning the dynamics of British economy and British politics. What do you think of, say, the difficulties and adversity that China is coping, not only with the UK, but the world over?
No, first of all, Mr. Wolf is a renowned journalist, and I highly respect his views. However, on this particular point, I would beg to differ from his view. I would say, let us give UK a little bit more time. Let it work out the mess that it is faced with. Whatever you call it, Brexit or otherwise, this situation or this event is truly a very messy exercise of democratic rights. And this is very unusual for UK, which is well known for many practices of democracy, constitutional monarchy, parliamentary representation, for example, you name it. And I would say, whatever pros or cons for Brexit, it is not yet coming to the final end of the process. Let us give UK more time. It must have some reason to want to do the Brexit, and there must be some reason for many people in UK who oppose a Brexit, and probably we still need to wait for 3 or 5 or even 10 years before the dust will really settle as to what exactly is the ultimate good or less than good or the bad of Brexit. That's number 1. Number 2 is that for China-UK relations, I'm a firm believer in the megatrend. I would say whichever government comes and go in UK, he or she really need to look at the reality on the ground in China-UK relations, especially in terms of economic situation, bilateral trade, cultural trade, for example. Whatever that would matter for the ultimate maximum national interest of UK will eventually prevail. And I firmly believe that between China and UK, we really need to promote our own national interest, but we would also need to really care for mutual interest. And the greater mutual understanding there is, the greater interaction there is between the two countries, I think both China and UK will benefit.
Probably it's unfair to say that Britain is a sick man.
I mean, let me also address some of the points which my colleague here addressed very eloquently to your first question. On the issue of Britain's relations with China, I don't think there is the gulf that you suggested between David Cameron's time and Mrs. May's. I was a cabinet minister under David Cameron's leadership, and I hugely welcomed the importance that he and George Osborne attached to the relationship with China. And you will have seen the leak from our National Security Council that Britain, unlike the other 5 members of the international intelligence community,
the Five Eyes,
the Five Eyes, have agreed that we welcome Huawei's involvement in the next generation.
But not in the core area of sensitivity.
Well, the point is that Britain has taken a far more pro-Chinese position than the other members of the Five Eyes. And I merely say that I think your suggestion that relations are markedly different now. They did go through a bump over the question of Chinese investment back in 2016 when Mrs. May became Prime Minister. But there are many forces in Britain, inside the government as well. After all, our Foreign Secretary knows China well, is married to a Chinese wife, who want to build on the excellent relations which took place under David Cameron and make sure that that golden era continues. So I wouldn't want you to suggest really that that relations are back in the cold freeze, because they're not. And on the subject of Britain being the sick man, you will have seen that our unemployment levels, and unemployment levels matter hugely because they are a clear signal of whether a society is sick if there's very high unemployment. Our unemployment levels are now lower in Britain than they've been since the 1970s. And so the economic success of Britain, many people predicted that the threat to leave the European Union would diminish our economic success and damage us, and so far there has been no sign of that. Now, I accept that there are many investment decisions which are waiting for Britain to sort out the Brexit
But Martin
problem.
Wolf complained about the poor productivity of
Yes,
the British economy.
that is true. Productivity is our biggest weakness, and we have to address that. But I'm just saying, in terms of sick man of Europe, which is an expression from the 1970s, forget it. Now, on the European Union is under great strain, and you're going to see in these European elections, I suspect, many populists elected in Italy and in the eastern part of the European Union. And that is bound to change some of the nature of the European Union. And in many ways, for people who were keen that Britain should leave, it is a travesty that at the point when we are leaving, actually the lust for ever closer union, bearing down on nationalism, is actually diminishing in the European Union.
Thank you very much. You are watching Dialogue with Mr. Andrew Mitchell, Member of Parliament in Britain, and Victor Gao-Zhikai, our regular commentator. We're discussing issues of multilateralism and whether we are following the process of deglobalization or the other way around. Stay with us. We'll be right back. Welcome back, Victor. Do you think China stands out prominently because of President Xi Jinping's advocacy for a more inclusive world with the implementation of a BRI? However, at the same time, Western media arouse strong criticism about what China intends to fulfill in the BRI. For example, the debt trap and export of overcapacity, as well as it's the SOE players of the Chinese economy that would benefit most from our investment in the infrastructure in the overseas market, allegedly. So what do you think of these accusations that China says no?
The BRI initiative is truly groundbreaking in China, as well as way beyond the Chinese border. And I think it has several good effects already. In China, I have never seen any other event prior to BRI which has rallied the Chinese people and opened the Chinese mind to the rest of the world and incentivized almost all the Chinese people, government entities, enterprises, corporations of all kinds, and created an outward-looking mentality. Almost everyone relevant in any position in China is talking about BRI, talking about walking out of China, working with friends and brothers and sisters in any parts of the world. Now, indeed, there are accusations or misrepresentations about BRI, but I think what really matters is that China and all the other participating countries need to do the right thing. Let us create a solid record and show them that these accusations are wrong. For example, barking at debt trap is actually the wrong thing. Whenever you want to do a major project, you need equity and debt. And if you are truly accusing the debt, for example, being overly burdensome on the borrower, then you come up with better solutions. Purely accusing of the debt trap itself doesn't solve the problem. Further, I would say, some people accuse many of the projects within the BRI framework are not economical, are not profitable in a sense. However, I've always said, whether it is economic or profitable, etc., is really relative. You really need to give the borrowing country or the borrowing entity more time to look at it not in a static way but in a dynamic way, because with the rollout of infrastructure and the build-up of connectivity, the value of the land, the value of all these assets, for example, will increase, and it will probably help the borrower or the borrowing countries to better pay off the debt. Anyway, so it's a dynamic process. However, I would say, let us really be very solid in doing the work, walk the right walk, talk the right talk, and let the track record 2 years from now speak for itself for those who are skeptical of BRI.
Nevertheless, we should allow the rest of the world to have benefits of doubt about what China aims to achieve through BRI. Now, UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres said recently that as the world's problems grow, multilateralism seems to be the best path to meet those challenges that lie ahead. Andrew, my question next is very much about how to reform the WTO, a very controversial multilateral body that may symbolize dispute settlement mechanism in the case of a trade war between the United States and China, for example. Both sides, and along with the Europeans, say that it's important, necessary to reform the WTO. However, our approach differs one from another radically. What do you think of the issue of multilateralism concerning the reform of the WTO, Andrew?
Well, can I first of all address the point that Antonio Guterres made, because that has a direct impact on all of this. And it is that the multilateral cause now, under great threat, as we've already said, is incredibly important in solving all the problems that are coming down the runway for the next generation. And though those problems aren't just trading problems and protectionism, they're also climate change, terrorism, migration, pandemics. These are all international problems which affect us all, but which can only be dealt with and addressed on a multilateral basis. And, narrow nationalism, as we have said, has grown very significantly over recent years. You can see it from Moscow down to Cairo. You see it in Trump and in Brexit. But the importance of the multilateral system is that it is the way in which we respond to these things. Now, when it comes to the WTO, a vital part of the multilateral system, it tends to march at the pace of the slowest. And I think that the trade difficulties between China and America will not be solved by the WTO. They will be solved bilaterally between America and China. And I very much hope that the noises coming out of Washington today suggest that we should be optimistic about that, because if these difficulties continue, they will clearly have a negative effect on the rest of the world. But in terms of the WTO, and I work closely with the former head of the WTO to try and make sure that the poorest countries in the world got an advantage from the last trade round. It was extremely difficult. You saw all the difficulties that arise from trying to operate through a system like the WTO. But nevertheless, it is really for the WTO and all its members in that forum to try and get to a better place and try and accept some of the core principles which actually unite China and Britain in terms of bearing down on protectionism, supporting free trade, and believing that you deal with these issues by negotiation and cooperation, and not through confrontation and bad faith.
Victor and Andrew, don't you think from the very beginning of our discussion here, we were barking at the wrong tree with regard particularly to what President Trump actually wants? In fact, it's not a process of a deglobalization that many of the international observers have pointed out recently regarding the rise of unilateralism during the years of Donald Trump. It's actually a process of re-globalization on American terms or on the terms of President Trump. For example, he has recently declared an end to the tolerance or sanctuary for the oil exports from Iran. He wants oil exports from the Persian state to be zero. And President Trump also canceled the Iran nuclear deal. And that means all major economic players other than the United States would be offended. Their interests would be seriously hurt. European Union, China, India, Japan, South Korea, most of them are the American allies. So what do you think of the harms of President Trump's efforts to re-engineer the process of re-globalization? And that means I win, you lose. It's a zero-sum game.
First of all, I think the United States is a great country, and I personally do not agree with the slogan that President Trump created, making America great again. We always think America was great, is great, and will still be great many, many years later. So there is no need to make America great again. Probably the Americans need to make America greater, for example. In that sense, I agree with that. On President Trump's many policy initiatives, I personally do not understand what exactly is the motivation for that. At least I would say he probably managed to damage the international standing of the United States tremendously. You know, whatever his real motive for walking out of the Iran deal, for example, or walking out of TPP and writing the treaty among United States, Mexico, and Canada, for example, he may have a reason for that, but he is doing that in such an abrasive and hostile way that I don't think he will get more friends for the United States. And this is, I think, truly a very, very bad record for the President of the United States. And eventually the American people will regret that their President is doing this for the United States. And I think for China, for example, we have no problem with dealing with the United States. We want to be friends with the American people, and we have tremendous amount of goodwill among the Chinese people for the American people. And we never want to have, let's say, hostility or total war with the United States, because that probably will be the end of the world. So I hope President Trump and his administration and the United States at large will really better understand the reality and the true nature of China as a country and as a society, and come to terms with the realities here in China, rather than creating an enemy out of nowhere and then being so seized up with this so-called enemy as if they can no longer sleep at night.
Perhaps Victor is talking about the issue of a self-fulfilling prophecy. Trying to find an enemy, to divert attention from domestic scandals and investigations against the presidency of Donald Trump to the alleged external threats. And China is unfortunately singled out in the crusade to bring jobs back and to fix the problem of the alleged industrial espionage and protection of IPR. Andrew, next question is about what President Xi Jinping said during his recent visit to European Union. He says the international community faces four problems: governance deficit, trust deficit, peace deficit, and development deficit. What did President Xi Jinping actually mean?
Well, I think the deficits he points out are broadly true. You know, we live in a world that is disfigured by these extraordinary discrepancies of opportunity and wealth. And for all of our security and prosperity, we need to try and heal that, and that's the development deficit. And actually, I think that China in Africa, I'm not a total supporter of China's policy towards economic development in Africa, but there is no doubt whatsoever that China's engagement in Africa has elevated living standards and has lifted quite a lot of the poorest people in the countries where China is heavily engaged out of poverty. So I think there is a development deficit where China is making a difference. I think the peace deficit that he referred to and the governance deficit are all issues with which we are grappling. In the case of the European Union, we've already rehearsed on this programme some of the governance issues that face us, and in Britain likewise we are wrestling with Brexit, and you were very generous, I thought, in saying that we will come through it, which we will. But there's no doubt at all that Brexit is a huge challenge, the biggest challenge during my 30 years in British politics and in the House of Commons. And we will get through it, but it is taking us time, and it's because actually in Britain we are a parliamentary democracy where we elect people like me to make decisions on behalf of those who elect us. And then if they don't like those decisions, they can boot us out in a general election on the next occasion. But a referendum which has dictated the result on Brexit has to be honoured, although most members of Parliament don't think it's the right decision. And on your point about Trump and the direction of travel in America, remember that America is very different, and the power of the president is very different from the power of the British Prime Minister or the Chinese president. The power in America is much more disaggregated. And so many of the things that he wants to do, which are the subject of great democratic debate in America and much dissent, are not actually happening, or they're taking an enormous amount of time. The separation of powers in America has meant that I would argue that many of the blunt edges have been knocked off Trump policy.
Thank you so much. Despite the glow of American democracy, we are clearly aware that the UK is both a parliamentary democracy and also a constitutional monarchy. The UK politics represents somehow a compromise between the two ends of the spectrum. That's British sophistication. Thank you so much for your meaningful participation and insightful analysis. And thank you for watching. I'll see you next time. Goodbye.